Welcome, welcome. And you're going to be glad you chose to be here today because we have a very special speaker that you're going to learn so much from and be inspired by. She and I were on a joint panel for a Congress hearing on dementia and brain health promotion. And when I heard her talk, I said, Dr. Sano, you have to come to Dallas. So this is, we're here today. I hope many of you came and were part of our Brain Health Week last week. How many of you were with us last week? Yay! I hope you will make sure not to miss it because it was so inspiring and just really a huge success. Most of you here know what we're all about. We are here to push forward the frontiers of brain health so that every single person, you included, as well as your colleagues and sphere of influence, will know what you can do to make sure your best brain year is next year versus 10 years ago, right? We want to be part of that. My name is Dr. Sandy Chapman. I'm the founder and chief director. I am a professor in the School of Behavioral and Brain Science, and this is my life, being able to discover, and every single day I feel excited for the new discoveries that are coming out of here. As Bonnie mentioned, there's going to be time for questions. If you're online, just put them in the Q&A, and if you're here, we will bring a microphone to you. For each of you that are here, you know that the Center for Brain Health's work is dedicated to not only teenagers, young adults, but to each of us throughout our decades, to the military, the workplace, wherever you are, you take your brain with you, and we want to make sure that the solutions go with you, because better brain health changes everything. Better brain health changes everything and for everyone. So I'm lucky to get to introduce and host Dr. Mary Sano. She's a PhD. She's a professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, which is one of our most prestigious medical schools in the country. She's director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and she is this year's recipient of the Lifetime Achievement. No one's given me a Lifetime Achievement. I'm too young, I wish. Award for the Alzheimer's Association and the International Psychogeriatric Association. She was given the Service Achievement Award. People recognize the work that she's done because she's dedicated her life to that. As a neuropsychologist, she's designed and conducted so many clinical trials to see what treatments and how can we prevent Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. She's the co-chair of the collaboration between this International Psychogeriatric Association and industry to define, detect, treat, and manage neuropsychiatric symptoms. She's the lead author on criteria for agitation and also apathy. And I love to hear, as she was talking about apathy, I think it's so interesting. All of us know people in our sphere of influence who have apathy. How does that influence our cognition is something that's really important to think about. She's trained so many, hundreds of people, investigators. She has hundreds of publications. She's consulted pharmaceuticals. I could go on and on. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Sano.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. And I am so impressed with the awareness that brain health goes across the spectrum, right? My work is primarily in aging and older individuals. So a lot of what you're going to hear about is my work in Alzheimer's disease, but also in people who want to prevent that disease. So let me get started. First of all, as you heard, I do a lot of things, and I do work with industry to help them design the best trials, and I'm also a member of data and safety monitoring committees, which means that when we do research in clinical trials, we actually watch very carefully to be sure that they're being done well. So these are the things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to sort of update you a little bit on the diagnosis and the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. I have been in this field since the 80s, and we have made monumental advances, right? We're not there yet, but we have made advances, and I really don't want to undermine those advances. I want everybody to know about them. I'm going to talk about the challenge of what we call secondary prevention of Alzheimer's disease. And then I'm going to talk about psychiatric and psychological symptoms that have been ignored for decades. They were only recently identified as important in these dementias and in cognitive impairment. I think it's really important. I want to talk to you about exactly what kind of impact they have so that we'll know they're important and we should treat them. And the other problem is we've really moved quite far along the spectrum with Alzheimer's disease, but not with the other dementias. And really, we need to focus on brain health, not only for Alzheimer's disease, but for all of those other things, for which we don't yet have a really good idea of how to treat them. So I wanted to just show you this umbrella that you may have seen before. And there's a truth and a fallacy in this umbrella. The truth is that many people who have dementia have Alzheimer's disease, right? They have Alzheimer's pathology, up to about 75%. But then you see these other conditions, and the reality is nobody has one disease. They often have more than one. So while we study things in a silo, we don't really live in a silo. So what you hear about may not be relevant at one moment, but might be relevant at a next. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. So this is a diagram I've shown for years, and I think it's really important because it talks about not only the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, but the pathology of everything. So what I'm showing you is that we do believe that before dementia, before you actually have functional problems because you're having cognitive problems or thinking problems, you can have just those cognitive problems, maybe not so impaired, and that means maybe not so detected. And what this slide shows is that the cognitive decline that can occur, and one of the things about this brain health program is we're fighting that cognitive decline, trying to find ways to keep it from happening. But what we know is it can happen for lots of reasons, right? So some of the reasons in this graph include the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, but there are many other things. There's synaptic dysfunction. Those are our nerves, our neurons not working perfectly. That may not be due to Alzheimer's. It may be due to something else. We also know that cerebrovascular risk factors, those are things that we might worry about in terms of cardiovascular or cerebrovascular health, they can also impact and create cognitive decline. So there's many reasons. And what this graph above shows is that particularly in Alzheimer's, it's the memory function that can predict that things are going to get worse, right? So what we're seeing here is that for those people who keep their function, memory or other cognitive function high, then they're less likely to deteriorate or to have more conversion to dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So what you can see, though, is once you have that cognitive decline, you really could be on a trajectory that may be harder to reverse, and it could be a trajectory that's identified because you have some disease that you want to address. The other thing I want to show you is that even for healthy aging, we see there's a decline. You can see that aging line is going down. So imagine being able to participate in an activity that would not require that goes down, but maybe would help you maintain it or even see it go up. So these are unexplored areas. But I'm going to focus right now on this group that does decline, because we know that happens, and we need to think about how we can have interventions that might help those individuals. So I start with this, and that is, so what is Alzheimer's disease per se, and what is Alzheimer's dementia? Well, now we say that the disease is the presence of the biology, meaning the proteins that are accumulating pathologically, and we don't yet know why, we just know that they are there, and we know that is what defines the disease. And we know it does have an impact on our synapses, the connections between the two neurons that help us learn and help us use new strategies. We know that there's another protein, tau. So we know that there's neurodegeneration in these two important proteins. That biology can exist before we have symptoms. The symptoms are the memory impairment or the other cognitive impairment. And in 2011, for the first time, I mean, this disease has been recognized since the 80s. For the first time, we acknowledged there can be behavioral impairment. It can it's first time entered into the diagnostic category. That's a long time. And yet, if you've ever seen a picture of Auguste D., you'll know that her symptomatology was primarily psychiatric and psychological, as well as her cognitive. But we've been ignoring this for a long time, and I think we're now starting to think about how important it is. So I want to say that while everything occurs together, right, there's usually more than one pathology, we've been very productive by separating out pathologies and trying to study them individually. So I want to say that Alzheimer's disease is very specific, right? Amyloid is the protein that defines Alzheimer's disease. So some people say, what about that amyloid hypothesis? That may not be true. It's not hypothetical. Amyloid is the definition of the disease, along with tau and neurodegeneration. So that's a big step forward because we now have something to target. It helps us focus on where can we make a difference. We can measure it, and it's not illogical that the first big movement in treatments in the past 2 decades was to focus on amyloid. That was the pathology that we know defines the disease. It's not enough, but it's certainly not unreasonable that we began there. So I want to talk a little bit about the framework, or this is the idea of how does the disease show itself. And what I'm showing you is a graph that starts the way we believe is that amyloid peaks before we have any symptoms. And then we see some synaptic dysfunction because when the amyloid is going up, the synapses aren't working well. And then there's tau injury as well. That's the other protein that accumulates in the brain. And then we might see some changes in the structure of the brain, the volume of the brain. And after those things, we start to see cognition changes and clinical function. Now, some of our ideas about this have changed, but that's the idea, is that the pathology is there before we see the symptoms. And so keeping your cognition and your function as high as it can be would reduce your likelihood of seeing the symptoms of this pathology. So an important aspect that we really haven't fully appreciated how much benefit we can get from that approach. So this is a slide that's now old, 2011, right? But it's a very big deal because when I entered the field, if you wanted to know for sure if someone had Alzheimer's disease, you didn't know until autopsy, right? We would say probable Alzheimer's disease. We don't need to say that anymore. We can see the amyloid in the brain, right? So we can actually see it in people who don't yet have any symptoms. So this, while it's a little frightening, is really helpful. We have a biological marker that we can use to say for sure, not probable Alzheimer's disease, but absolute. It doesn't say that the person's demented or that they have a cognitive problem, but it does say they have a bad biology. An even bigger advance is we can now do this through blood biomarkers. Imagine that imaging that I was talking about requires that we are someplace where there's a scanner and that the scanner has to have a ligand that you make someplace else and you transport. That's a lot of work and it's very expensive. Now it can be done with a blood test. So again, while we might be worried that you could over-identify people or identify them maybe before we're ready to do anything, this is still a very big advance. And I don't think we should ignore it. I think we should accept it as a big step forward. Now, one of the other things that has gone on is that We spent a lot of time today. I met with many different people, and we're talking about assessment and how do we know how somebody's doing and how do we measure. And I think this is another advancement that I want to talk about. This is something called the clinical dementia rating. It is now a tool that can be used in clinical trials. And the way we do it is we interview the patient and we interview an informant, a family member, somebody who knows them well. We call them a study partner in our research. And we ask them questions. Some of them are questions that they have to perform a task on. And we ask them to remember things. It's very applied. And one of the things about this outcome measure is it's been validated that we can train people to do it reliably, and it measures both cognition and function at the same time. Why is that a big deal? Because until we had this single outcome measure, we had to use 2 outcome measures for trials in Alzheimer's disease. By only having to use one, we can make the sample size smaller. We don't have to see as many people to know if we get a benefit. So again, this is often poo-pooed as not a very big deal, but this is an advance in the science. So as I said, we have the outcome measure, we now have amyloid, and we now have drugs that treat amyloid, right, that can remove amyloid from the brain, and they get a benefit. It's not a cure. It doesn't wipe out all the deficit, but it does make a difference, and that's what I'm showing you here. This is a graph from one of the first drugs that was approved, lecanemab. You may know it by the name Leqembi. And in this data that was used to get the drug approved, what you can see is there's a significant difference in the deterioration in those people who were taking Leqembi versus the placebo over 18 months. Right? I'm not pushing this drug. I'm just saying we made progress. We have something that's working. It's working on the CDR, which is a combined measure, but it's also working on the ADAS-Cog. That's a cognitive measure. You can see it's working on the ADL. That's a functional measure, activities of daily living. And in every case, the lecanemab was showing a benefit over placebo over 18 months. The ADCOMS is another measure that combines them all. But this is real progress. There's now a second drug. This drug shows the same thing. What you're seeing is that the drug, again, over about 18 months, shows a better performance in the donanemab group, the treatment. In the CDR sum of boxes, the cognition, the ADAS-Cog, and the function. That's a big deal, right? We were all skeptical because we thought, oh, just by making that CDR sum of boxes, you're not going to see benefit in these other areas. These are hard to move markers, but every one of them moved. So we made progress, right? No cures, but we've made progress. And it did it. This is from the lecanemab study, but we see it in both studies. The amyloid removal was 100%. 100% doesn't mean that all of it's gone forever, but at the end of the 18 months, it removed to levels that were considered normal. So it was a goal. Use this as a target, see if you get a benefit, and it happened, right? So I say this to you because I want you to understand that the science really led to an advancement that we now have access to. Nothing comes without side effects, and some of them are worrisome. Some of the side effects change depending on what your genetic risk factor is. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But in general, the biggest side effect, most common, was infusions, because these drugs are given as an infusion either every 2 weeks or once a month. And the second side effect, not to be poo-pooed, is what we call ARIA. ARIA is amyloid imaging related abnormalities. So we know when we remove the amyloid, we can get some abnormalities that look possibly like little strokes. But as it turns out, most people had those strokes in the beginning, and they were just made a little worse. And so it's a good question. Maybe if you had them, you would not be a person who would take this drug. But if you didn't, maybe it would be worth the kind of change that you're making. So I mentioned this apolipoprotein E. Has everybody in this room heard about that? Okay. So we know this is a risk gene. What we know about the risk gene is that it increases your likelihood of having Alzheimer's disease. And we know that if you have one, we all have two alleles of the ApoE. If you have one E4, you have a risk that's about 3 times higher. And if you have two, it's about 10 times higher than the average. So these are people who have an added risk for taking this drug, but they also have an added risk for having Alzheimer's disease. So it's a real balancing act. There's no answer here, but it's a balance to figure out what is best for you at a given point in time. And finally, one of the biggest burdens of this drug is that it has to be by infusion, either an in-home or an infusion at an infusion center. And now one of them has moved on to, started to create an injection that can be given by someone at home. So that's, again, an advance. But I want to be sure, these aren't cures. We've gotten rid of that amyloid, but there's still damage in the brain. There's still the tau, and there's still the neural degeneration. So I want to talk a little bit about the staging of Alzheimer's disease that we're doing right now. And what I've done here is I've circled this point where we talk about the syndromes, right? So if you have a cognitive complaint and you go and talk to your doctor, it's hard to get in to see that doctor. So you must have really had a complaint that got you there. If you go there and he does a blood test and says you have amyloid, we know that there's something wrong. And we're going to put you in that path of saying, okay, now if you go to the doctor and he gives you a cognitive test and you're perfectly normal, maybe you go home and say nothing's wrong. Well, now we can still do the blood test, and he could find out that you have amyloid. So now you don't have a syndrome of cognitive impairment, but you have a risk factor. In fact, you technically have a disease. You have the amyloid. So again, with the biomarker available, this is not going to be rare anymore. We can just take a blood test and find out. So what are we going to do about these individuals? Can we treat the Alzheimer's disease to prevent cognitive loss and dementia? And that's really what's going on right now. There are at least 3 studies looking to see if individuals who are cognitively intact, maybe worried, maybe they know they have a family history, if they can delay the cognitive deterioration by treating this amyloid. The jury's out. I'm not saying we know that you can do this. I'm just saying we're now able to ask that question. The question, what can we do or what should we do? I showed you that one before. Right, but this slide was to remind me, we refer to this as secondary prevention, right? And we call it secondary because the pathology's already there. We know it for sure. In some cases, we don't know, right? Or some cases, it's not there. But in the cases where we know it's there, we refer to this as secondary prevention. We don't know whether or not it will work, but that's what the goal of these studies are. So what do we know about these pre-symptomatic individuals? 17% of those people over the age of 65 are amyloid positive. Now let me tell you that that's the overall percent, right? At 65, the number is low. At 75, it's higher. At 79, it's even higher, right? So, but that's worth knowing. Might be worth knowing who you are. And then in those people who are positive, over a period of 4 years, about a third of them worsen. Many of them convert, but that's the number, is a third. So here's a planning problem. I said here's the challenge. If you're 75 years old and you're positive, but you don't have any symptoms, are you going to find out if I can slow your deterioration when only a third of you are going to get worse? It's an individual decision, right? And the healthier we are at 75, the more likely we are to say, yeah, I care about my cognition. And that's happening at the same time. We're getting physically healthier. And so we want to keep our brains healthy, and this may be a reason to engage in treatment at this stage. On the other hand, some of these are burdensome and they have some risk, and other people may say, no, I'm going to take my chances. So in those with positive amyloid, age and sex do not affect the worsening, right? Now, we all know that women are more likely to have Alzheimer's disease, and we all know that the older you get, the more likely you are to have Alzheimer's disease, whether it's the disease, the pathology, or the symptoms. And I told you that when I said, at 65 it's low, but it goes up. But once you have positive amyloid, that doesn't matter. Your trajectory of change is about the same, right? So I said, if you're 75, you may say, oh, well, I'm old, or I'm 80, I'm not going to do this. But the reality is you could still be healthy, and the rate of change is still the rate of change because you have that pathology. So that may move your decision in a different direction. In those without amyloid, age and sex does affect your cognitive worsening, right? So again, remember, 17%. What does that leave? That leaves you more than 80% that are okay, right? That's a lot of people in this room. So what does that mean? It means that you are going to show some cognitive worsening. And again, that's why this model of brain health and changing that trajectory to not be deteriorating, but to possibly be stabilizing and improving is a big deal. So I wanted to show you this graphically. And this is data from the first study to be completed that looked at this secondary prevention. These are individuals who are asymptomatic. They are individuals who were over 65 or 65 and over, and they had amyloid or they did not have amyloid, right? So what I'm showing you is on the top line is that yellow line is a group called LEARN. These people came in to be in the study. They didn't have amyloid, but we said, would you like to be followed? And we followed them for 4 years. That is a long follow-up, right? Mean age at the start of the study was about 70 for everybody. So then we had this group that were called A4 participants. They were either drug or placebo. And in that particular study, the drug didn't work, so we put the whole group together to see what happens over time. And what we're showing you is that the group that was at the top part, the least amount of amyloid, but enough to be called positive, that those people really didn't deteriorate. That's the sort of green line. They barely were any different than the first group. And again, this is a change on a memory score. It's not a transition to dementia. So you can see it's a process, but it's a somewhat slow process. What's interesting is we got even more precision when we used the blood test. We could use different cutoffs in the blood test and even better predict the trajectory. So again, this is a very big move forward. And I want you to think about it as the importance of what we've accomplished in this. Everybody says, no, we've made no progress. We actually have, So I want to talk about what does it mean, right? What does this mean when you're amyloid positive? Well, it says that you're, quote, pre-symptomatic, but you could actually be a little different than the ones who are amyloid negative, or you could be a little different than you were when you were amyloid negative, right? So it refers to the presence of amyloid in a measurable amount. It refers to the absence of cognitive symptoms or complaints, right? There's very little known about the full profile of this condition, right? We don't know very much about which things are worse and which things are better and what happens over time with those. The one study I just told you about was about 1,000 people for 4 years. That's the full set of data, and that data was collected almost 10 years ago now. So we really don't know a lot. Also, little is known about their psychiatric or their behavioral profile. Also could be important, right? I mean, we've just said that that could make the biggest difference in their progression. We don't know about their function. And we know very little about their health economics, meaning if you were positive, does it make a difference? Do you see a doctor more often? Do you need help with things? Do you work less? We don't know. So we want to make headway in that area. So we've compared some interesting health, what we call economic outcomes over time in individuals who were pre-symptomatic and either had amyloid or did not have amyloid, okay? Now, before I get there, I have to tell you a little bit about this health economic measure. We have been studying people who are milder and milder because I believe it's because our society is so technological. We don't really have room to have somebody have a cognitive failure because it'll be hard for them to just function in everyday life. Everything's so technical. So we've been using something that we refer to as a resource use test, in which we tried to see in our general population that was kind of mild but were symptomatic, whether or not these individuals who had a very mild CDR had an impact on things that, and this is regardless of their amyloid, if they had an impact on their day-to-day use of medical things or their ability to hold a job. So what I'm showing you here is we had 3 separate variables. One is home health care. The next one is informal care, which means your family reports or you report that you need some more help than usual from your family, or employment or volunteering. So let me just tell you about this. I think about more than 75% of people over the age of 65, if they're not working, they're actually doing something that's important, taking care of children, doing volunteer work in a program. So even though they may not be getting paid for it, it's work that has value, right? So the question is, when we see changes in these outcomes, does it make a difference in those kind of everyday things? And what I'm showing you here is in this group, the baseline didn't make as big a difference in these mild cases. What made a difference was the change. So if you were getting worse, what we found is that you had a difference in how much you were able to do volunteer or regular work. And we found a smaller effect in informal care. There were more people helping you out, right? So we could change that to dollars, but in terms of day-to-day life, doesn't that matter? I can't do my hobbies or my volunteer work, or I have to ask for more help from someone. So in symptomatic individuals, we discovered that using our estimates, that there's a reduction of about 32 hours of informal care and 46 hours of home health care, and an increase, meaning a loss again of hours lost for doing either employment or volunteer work. I think that what's really important is we know about the burden of a person who's severely demented, right? We know that they're going to need around-the-clock care for a lot of reasons. But these early cases where we've always said, oh, there's not much impact, we're showing that there can be impact. So it is really important from a societal point of view. So what about those without symptoms? We did a similar measurement in that A4 and Learn study that I was telling you about. So this was a 4-year study of individuals who were in this clinical trial. We used the resource use, the same questions I just told you about that were helpful in our symptomatic group. We had a couple of different measures. We had the amyloid PET measure for them, and we also had the primary outcome, which was the CDR sum of boxes and a cognitive test called the PAC. So this test is very sensitive and is particularly useful in people who are intact. We conducted this analysis where we controlled for age, and we we controlled for all of the things that we know can affect a person's need for help and services. And this is just to tell you, again, you can see these individuals are between 70 and 71. They're not much different. I mean, the A4 group is a little bit different. They're a little bit older, but only about a year or so. But they're pretty comparable. So what did we find out? What we discovered is that at baseline, across all of the groups, a better cognitive score, right, was associated with a higher likelihood of participating in employment and a higher likelihood of volunteering and a lower likelihood of needing any kind of hospitalization. But over time, subtle decreases in those things that matter, the employment, the ability to do volunteer work, were apparent. And the likelihood of using unpaid help went up with a decrease over time with these decreases. What's really interesting is this was associated with their measures of cognition and function, but not with their amyloid levels. So what this tells us is, while the biology is important, we can make very important differences, potentially make very important differences by keeping the cognition and the function high. So I think this is a really important thing. It's not to say that prevention of or treating amyloid early isn't important, but it's not the only thing that's important. Yes, so what you need to see here is that the lines join. This is on those people who are amyloid positive and amyloid negative. What you see is they really don't separate. There's a little bit of separation on the volunteer, but they don't separate. They only separated when we looked at those people who had high or low cognitive scores, who had changes on their CDR. Okay, so I want to change gears a little bit. I told you how I thought it was so important that we don't just talk about cognition, but that we also talk about the non-cognitive symptoms, the behavioral symptoms, and the psychological symptoms that can occur. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on that, and I'm really going to start with people who have cognitive complaints, right? Because it's a little bit less studied in people who have no complaints yet. So one of the things is we've discovered this condition. You may have heard of mild cognitive impairment, MCI, but have you heard of MBI, right? We've become aware that there's a condition by which at the stage of transitioning to some cognitive impairment, maybe even before the cognitive impairment, we can see behavioral changes. Mild ones, some of them are distressing, not necessarily always identified as behavioral problems. So it's possible that in that pre-dementia state, this complements MCI. One of the things about MCI is if you're high functioning, you may not be able to measure the difference in your cognition, but you might be showing frustration, irritability, or apathy, any of these things. That could be a serious marker of the beginning of a neurodegenerative disease. These syndromes are defined in people over the age of 50, and it refers to significant and persistent change for over 6 months in individuals who have no other reason to be having a change, or not people who have lifelong psychiatric illness and it's just a worsening of that. It really occurs oftentimes in the absence of a major cognitive impairment. You might have a subtle one, but not necessarily. And it's really also defined as something that's not better described because of a psychiatric or medical condition. We know, for example, with certain drugs, a person can suddenly become more agitated or disturbed. So those things need to be ruled out. But we understand that when you have this condition, newly identified personality or behavior change, it can be a risk factor for further dementia or cognitive decline. So the range of symptoms is quite broad. It could be anything from affective or emotional dysregulation. That would be not only depression and anxiety, but apathy. And I'm going to talk a lot about apathy in just a minute. It can be impulse discontrol, right? Unable to control yourself in a frustrating situation. It can be delusions or hallucinations, and particularly delusions. You know, I think these people are out to get me. They never had that thought before, but it can precede and be a marker. Social inappropriateness, not being aware of your social surroundings. So these are symptoms that we're now becoming aware might actually be early markers of cognitive change leading to a neurodegenerative condition. And this is just a small study taken from the data from a very large study called ADNI, Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging. And there was a small cohort in which they were able to define MBI. At the time of this study, it didn't exist. So they had to create it from the data that they had. And what you can see is that the individuals who have it are more likely to have the biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. So that's a hint, but that's a very small data set. We've looked at a much bigger data set. The data set's referred to as SNAC. This is data from over 40,000 individuals who have been assessed by dementia experts at Alzheimer's centers around the country. And the physician, the clinician, one of the things he has to say is, does the person have any of these symptoms, right? And they may or may not even be reported by the family member, but after the physician's evaluated, they make a decision. And what you can see is that we've gone through a range: apathy, depression, irritability, agitation, disinhibition, delusion, hallucination. What is so interesting is that the most common one is apathy. Now, this is very interesting because it's not that someone complains, it's that the doctor looks at them and says, you know, there's just something about them that makes me say they have apathy. And what I'm also showing you is that it is pretty persistent, right? More than 10% of this cohort have apathy always. Another 20%, almost 30%, have it persistently. Right, so this is something that really exists and is very common, and we don't talk much about it. We tend to, and in fact, we've discovered that a lot of people don't complain about it because maybe as a person gets a little more impaired, they're a little easier to take care of if I don't address the apathy. You know, they're calmer, but what we really know, and I just want, is that apathy can be very damaging, and I'll show you in just a minute. But what I wanted you to see is that that was our data, but here are like a multitude of studies that show that apathy occurs in a lot of neurodegenerative conditions, not just in Alzheimer's disease. And what we've discovered is that it emerges early. So in our people who are at their first visit and have a CDR of 0.5, that means they have mild cognitive impairment. Almost 20% of them already have apathy, right? If they're mildly impaired with Alzheimer's and they have a CDR of 1, almost 50%. And what you can see is that over visits, it goes up and up, right? So it's there, it's persistent, and mostly we don't treat it. Now, what I think is so fascinating is apathy is associated with a much more rapid decline of function, not just cognition, but function. So that means your activities of daily living are going down the tubes. And what you can see is the persistence of apathy really dramatically increases the likelihood of functional impairment. So the blue line are those who have never had apathy, and on each of these graphs, whether you're mild or moderate or severe, all three of them show that apathy makes a big difference. It increases the impairment in ADLs, activities of daily living. The other thing that's interesting is apathy in general is apparent across all of these dementias, right? And the persistence is the same problem. In some conditions, it goes to close to 100%. So it is truly a real problem, and it is truly a problem that is associated with a lot of impairment. So I want to take a minute to just talk about this. The challenges of detecting these neuropsychiatric symptoms is that the cognitive components of neurodegenerative disease have really taken prominence in our evaluation. So no, people don't really ask. And the biomarkers for neurocognitive diseases are precision for underlying pathology, but not for these behaviors. And the stigma can be very high for reporting these behaviors. So we really have to do a lot of work here to identify them so that we can treat them. So I did want to just before I talk about my attempt to tell you why brain health is so important, I wanted to remind you of something. This is a very important study. It was sponsored by Medicare. And basically, it was individuals who got to see a dementia specialist, and if the doctor thought that they might have Alzheimer's disease, you could get, Medicare would pay for your amyloid PET, right? So these doctors, specialists around the country, would send people. And if people had a dementia diagnosis, they were pretty accurate, but still almost 30% did not have amyloid. They did not have Alzheimer's disease. And if you look at the MCI, almost half of them didn't have Alzheimer's disease. So there's other pathologies. And we really don't know a lot about those other pathologies. Do you think those people who didn't have amyloid went home and all got well? Probably not. And so this is really where we need to focus on what else we can do. So it's really understudied, and other neurodegenerative conditions have really biology and genetics that we need to know more about. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about is they send you back to your doctor, but you really need primary psychiatry, cardiovascular, metabolic, all of these things. You really need to talk about a brain health approach that's holistic, that covers the full domain. And I wanted to talk about that in terms of the risk and resilience. You know, everybody's seen this Lancet commission, which talks about different risk factors in midlife and in late life. And many of them we know about, but they're not enough. They're really not enough. And the Alzheimer's Association was aware of this, and they created the Pointer Study for just that reason. Now, the Pointer Study was individuals who had high risk because they didn't engage in anything in terms of socialization, physical activity, healthy diet. They actually had to be negative on those things. So that means there's room to improve. And in fact, they did show that people improved. People improved cognitively in their cognitive composite. They actually showed that whether or not you had a structured in-person event or whether you did it self-guided, a little more remote, you got a benefit, right? So this data really should remind us there's a lot to be done, even if we don't have Alzheimer's disease. And we really need to know more about what makes it most effective. So I just want to say, I think the takeaways from this are that enhancing your lifestyle can really improve cognition. And you get bigger effects when you have a human navigator. Well, maybe that's because you have more connectedness. That could be a very important aspect. The biggest challenge is compliance, and you're going to hear about that anytime you hear about brain health. If you're not in it, you can't win it, and you really do need to be in it to make this better. Engagement is really an important outcome, just making sure people stay engaged. So I'm going to give you my summary and take some questions. I think I want to start by reminding you, Alzheimer's disease is specific, detectable, and treatable. So don't walk away from it. If you think that's what the issue is, find out. Prognostic markers for dementia really need to include not just clinical biomarkers and cognitive assessment. We need to think about the psychiatric and the psychological as well. More than a third of those seen in a specialty memory clinic did not have Alzheimer's disease. So there are other things out there, and we really need to do more to improve them. And I have to say that I think this approach to a broad approach that includes lifestyle and health management can make a big difference. And I have to say, I don't really do anything alone, and I'm just a small cog in the middle of my ADRC team. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so wow, if you're not in it, you can't win it. If we're going to take that one, that's true. If you're not in it, it's got self-agency. So I know there must be thousands of questions. Try to keep them small. Don't tell us the whole story. Just give us a little quick question that we can answer from one of the world's experts. Sarah.
Thank you. So the first part of your talk really had me thinking about the importance of recognizing if you've got this amyloid buildup. But then I thought back to the nun study that was with the Sisters of Notre Dame that saw that they followed nuns as they aged and found that many of them showed no signs of cognitive impairment in life and yet had this amyloid buildup in death. And so I wonder now, in the context of everything you've learned since that study, how do you think about the results of that study, and how should we weigh that in thinking about when it's time to intervene, even with this buildup?
I think this is a good question. It's the balancing act, right? I mean, think about how old the nuns study are, and some of them did live long. The truth is, the longer you live, the more likely you are to have amyloid in your brain, right? But those people probably didn't have amyloid in their brain when they were 65. They probably had it at death, and that's the big issue, right? And I don't say, let it be the amyloid that makes you go out. Don't just look for the amyloid. You might look for the amyloid if everybody in your family had Alzheimer's disease, or if you're noticing changes, but you just don't go look for the amyloid. So I agree. And let me just say that I know that's everybody's worry, that we're going to have too many people who have amyloid. But when we did one of our new studies, we went down to the age of 55, but we didn't get anybody, right? The amyloid really doesn't start to accumulate until you're after 60. But if only 10% have amyloid after 60, that 10% much higher risk. So, question?
Now? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes.
Well, I was caught by the amyloid test, and the number of people who have cognitive decline, or who do not have cognitive decline with it, and the ones that have it have cognitive decline and don't get the test. What are your criteria for ordering the blood amyloid test?
Right. I believe that you only order it in those cases who have a concern or a worry or a symptom. That's the way I would do it. But these new studies may change that. If you can actually find that you get a benefit, you don't deteriorate as much if you treat, then people might think differently. But right now, we don't have that. It is truly a study that will tell us whether or not knowing your amyloid when you have no symptoms is worth it.
So if a patient is concerned about their memory, is that criteria enough to get the test?
I think that when you're concerned about your memory, the thing you do is you discuss the concern with a professional to tell you whether or not that concern sounds like an aging concern or a true cognitive impairment, right? So a lot of times people will say, because it's still important, knowing what your cognitive status is, get the evaluation for your cognition, and then decide if you really need it.
Mary, this is me. This is where if we had annual brain health checkups, we would know what that worry is and could really monitor. So we've got to change the way we treat the brain from a proactive versus reactive. So we're going to work on that and get that done. There's a question over here.
I wondered if you could speak a little more about what you mean by apathy, because I think I know depression and the others
Right.
when I hear it or see it, but
Right.
apathy, I'm not really sure.
It's so interesting that you say this, because when we were trying to design a trial to treat apathy, we were doing it in this room that had a lot of experts, and some of the experts were from the centers where we actually had collected the data. And they said, well, I never see it. And I said, well, the data says you do see it. So what is it? It's the sense of being less engaged. It's the sense of not caring. It's a sense of having a flat affect, not being sad, not being happy, but not being responsive. And it also is a little motivational, right? So it is a condition that people seem to recognize, and they recognize it repeatedly from year to year. The family member may not even notice it. They may say, oh, they're just getting old. They don't care as much about their hobbies or things like this. But when the physician or the clinician asks the questions, that's when it gets identified.
Excuse me, regarding apathy,
Yeah.
would you consider noticeably increased procrastination as falling under?
Well, I guess it depends on what you're doing while you're procrastinating, right? Are we procrastinating because we're engaged in some better activity? Or is it the procrastination that might be determined by not doing anything, right? I mean, that's really the issue. And I may be biased because I procrastinate certain things. It's getting to be tax time. So, you know, but I have to say, it's not just the procrastination, it's not having anything that fills it in. So.
Mary, I think dentists may be really good at detecting apathy. They, you know, as they watch people come in and see, and, you know, I always get questions from, and actually spoke to an international thing of dentists, and they're like, what do we do? Because you can see that. And I think apathy is one of the things they start to see in their dental care.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm going to have a comment and then a question. And the comment is, it's a little bit narcissistic, but I've read the Pointer study, and I wonder why the Chapman study didn't get as much amplification, because I think we've seen this over time.
Right.
And so then my follow-up is,
Can I ask you,
Yes.
when you say amplification, you mean press?
yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah.
can tell you what.
And then secondarily is a bit of a so what question. It seems like we always come back to, why don't we all assume that we're at risk for Alzheimer's and proactively start those lifestyle interventions like today?
Right.
We still are waiting for that diagnosis, and is that just because then it strikes the fear into action based
Yeah.
on what you find?
Right. So let me just say, and this is, we're all responsible for this. The press came, I believe, because this was funded by the Alzheimer's Association, right? And they wanted to make sure that the money they put into this was worth it, that people knew the results. But what I want to say to all of you in the room who do research, when that paper goes out, whether it's positive or negative, work to let everybody know. You worked hard, you did really legitimate, robust science. Make sure you convert it to some message that can get out there, right? You really need to do this. People think that science isn't doing anything. We really need to get that message out, right? All of your institutions have PR offices. Get that word out. No matter how small it is, get that word out. So that's what I think, number one. But why does everybody? Why don't I work harder to lose weight? Why don't I work harder to learn a language? Why don't I work harder? There are so many pressures on us. I'm not saying that it isn't important. We all think it's important. I think it's important that I do physical activity, but I didn't do any yesterday, right? I mean, so it is an issue of integrating all of these things. I mean, I think that's one thing about the brain health approach is it is comprehensive, right? It's holistic. So instead of saying, I didn't do anything yesterday, I hate myself, I got up this morning and did it, right? So that's the point. You need to hold on to not what you don't do, but what you did do or what you can do. And to realize it can be anywhere, right? When I'm trying to get back on top of my eating, my diet, my family will say, well, you can't do it tonight. We're going to a party. I'm like, yes, I can. Yes, I can. You know, just a little less. Anyway, that's my perspective. So, do you have
Is there one online? And because this last question,
Sorry, I'm taking too much time. No.
not one
No, I can-
online,
you
just
wanna
one.
Yeah, so they feel like
One online.
with us.
What is the insurance coverage for tests?
Oh, that's always a good question. In the context of having symptoms, there is insurance coverage. there's always copays. You know, I can't tell you about your individuals. But the reality is now, at least with Medicare and even with a lot of other insurers, there is now coverage if you have symptoms, right? If you don't have symptoms, join BrainHealth.
There you go. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. So you probably guessed it. I'm going to figure out a way to partner with this scientist. She's so well respected and has done such great work, and we will all benefit. And the brain health approach is something to be proactive. Your brain matters. We hope you'll be part of the Brain Health Project and support our mission, too. We make these lunches available for this, so please help our organization and donate for that. Join us next week for Dr. Andrew Michael on talking about an entorhinal cortex circuit in cocaine memories. Thanks again, Dr. Sano, for being with us today. I know that everyone learned so much. I think each of us had a different takeaway, and it'd be fun to do stickies on those. You gave us so much food for thought. So, inspired, let's go get rid of our beta amyloid and take our brain seriously. And no more apathy around here.